All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the game of the day for day 6 of the Chessable Masters. We had the quarterfinal action today, the first mini matches between Hikaru Nakamura, Ding Liren, and on the other side we had Anish Giri against Alexander Grischuk. I chose this game because it came from an opening that these two guys have battled many times already in the Magnus Store, and it's an opening that both sides know extremely well. Hikaru plays the Berlin, which this is going to be, starts like this. He plays the Berlin as black, and so does Ding Liren. They're both maybe the two strongest proponents of this right now, who play it, really kind of religiously. While of course many other players play the Berlin, but these guys really make it the number one thing in their repertoire. And so it's very interesting to see how they play here. And they had two games that actually follow the same variation in a previous match that they played just a few weeks ago. So it was interesting to see who would first come up with an improvement. I do realize here I say tactic of the day instead of game of the day. I'm fixing that right now. Okay, so it goes. So they played D3, and this has been sort of the latest fashion, I would say. Of course, it's still entirely possible to play into the Berlin endgame, right? That goes like this. But White has struggled to prove an advantage in this endgame for many years, right? It started with Kramnik holding this against Kasparov, and then for a period of time, it seemed like White was pushing, having pressure. But nowadays, it's been kind of a struggle to be able to win, as players have really kind of worked out the defensive schemes for Black. So White has been playing this line with D3, and it does lead to pretty rich play after bishop C5, bishop takes C6, pawn takes C6, castles. Castles is one of the moves, but both players have played this position actually from both sides. So knight D7, and in fact, they had this very position a couple of times already in their own matches facing each other. So I continue here, knight to C4. So White puts pressure against the E5 pawn, rook to E8, A4, A5, and now Hikaru plays H4, which I think was a new move when he played it for the first time against Ding Liren a couple of weeks ago, and he repeats it. I do think he also played bishop E3 in this position, and then another move which is possible played by Anand among other players is to play B3, which is a bit of a different setup. The idea to play bishop B2. Eventually, Black will play F6, and then White can decide whether they want to play for D4 or play for something like F4 to try to open up this diagonal, but that's a different plan altogether. But H4 had been played by Hikaru once. He clearly believes in it enough. It's a bit of an odd move, but it's in some cases the pawn here helps with H5, H6. For now, the bishop can't come to G4, which would normally be the drawback of the pawn being on H4, and that's important because we're going to look at the game, and this becomes very relevant. But in the game where Hikaru had played it, he had obtained a pretty good position after B6, which is what Ding Liren had played then. Bishop to E3, bishop F8, and then Hikaru had played G3, eventually played F4. He got a pretty good position in that game, and so he decided to repeat it. But now Ding Liren had come with a novelty here. He plays knight to B6. And this is a little bit of an odd move, but it is the number one move that Lila, the neural network engine that all of these guys are using for preparation, I do have it on my computer, and it is the number one move that it suggests. And it's an interesting move. There's a tactical justification. It looks a bit odd because usually, it would hang the pawn. But in this case, because the pawn is on H4, Black's queen can take it. And here, Black's position is certainly quite reasonable. It seems like the queen is very active here. It doesn't feel too safe to have the king on G1 in that position. Black seems quite okay here. Nice pressure against F2 as well. And with the two bishops and the position opening up, it feels a little unsafe for White. So that's the tactical justification of it. And otherwise, the idea is that it actually clears out this very nice G4 square for the bishop. So White would often, want to play H3 in a position like this. Unfortunately, pawns, as you know, don't move backwards in chess. And so he's kind of stuck. So that's the idea. That being said, I'm sure Hikaru had seen this in his preparation. He plays knight to E3, normal move. It stops the bishop from coming to G4. But Dingley Ren here makes the move bishop takes e3, and it seems odd to give the bishop pair, but it is justified here by the fact that this square on g4 is weakened by the pawn being on h4. So it makes a lot of sense. F takes e3. He's almost forced to play this because if he plays bishop takes e3, then bishop g4 is really quite annoying because there's a simple threat of taking this pawn, and you don't really want to play g3 because g3 means that you have a very nasty pin here. In fact, black would probably already be much better with a move like f5, exploiting the pin. So because of that, he's forced to play pawn takes e3. And then after knight d7, the knight has a very nice maneuver back to f6 and then potentially to g4. And I have to say that it seems to me like this opening has been a success for Dingley Ren. And so his preparation here paid off, and he's got a nice position. This is not to say that black is really better or anything, but certainly it seems like black has a more comfortable position, and it's a little bit easier to play. Bishop d2. So now we get into a sort of slow moving game where both sides make moves that improve their position a little bit, but it becomes easier for black to play. This was a nice maneuver. He plays rook to a6. The rook comes to either g6 or f6, and that's a very nice way to take advantage of the fact that he hasn't been forced to play b6 yet, which sometimes you are. So now he's saying, okay, I'm going to bring my rook first to g6, and only then will I play b6. And so black is a little bit better here probably because he just has activity on the king side, and white's king side is sort of forever going to be slightly weak. That being said, it should be hard to break through the white position here, and I think that's why Hikaru was at some point kicking himself when things got a little bit worse. So I'm not going into too many details here because it becomes sort of a shuffling game where both sides are making sure not to make mistakes, and neither side has obvious pawn breaks. This is the main feature of this position. There's very few pawn breaks. Black can at some point try to play g5, but it's very difficult to make that work with the pawn on f6 and the possibility for white to have all of their rooks aiming at it. The only other pawn breaks would be something like c4, which is sometimes in the air actually, and that's one of the reasons for putting the queen on e8 and white moving their rook to a1 is that the rook defends this pawn. So there's not a lot of pawn breaks. The only other one, b5, not particularly threatening. It doesn't really do anything if just to make the pawn structure worse for black. So there's not a whole lot of pawn breaks, which makes this position. That's why they play so many moves here very quickly. So Hikaru has traded off a pair of rooks. Note, black couldn't really take on h4 because of queen takes f6, which is a more important pawn than the h4 pawn, and later black will probably lose the e pawn as well. So a pair of rooks gets traded off, but that doesn't really change the character of the position. Oh, I did want to mention here, Magnus Carlsen did tweet that the king would come to b7. He was correct. Black decides that it's time to bring the king to the queen side because he feels like he has chances to at some point play for kingside play. And in that case, if he's going to eventually play g5, for example, you would rather have the king on b7 and on g8. And it shows that there's not a lot of pawn breaks in this position when you can go on such an escapade, of course. So they keep making moves here. I will get us to where it gets interesting. It does seem like white should be able to hold this endgame here. They traded queens, and it doesn't seem like black has an obvious plan. But let's see what Dingley Ren tries to do here. So first he plays for b5, and that was a good plan. What he's trying to do here is fix the white pawn structure, right? So he's going to play b5 and then b4. And if white takes on b5, then black will be able to create a passed pawn, and with that, they'll have at least some chances. So he plays b5, and then he plays b4. And so what b4 does is that it creates the chance to play c4 at some point. And so he's now he's got potential breaks on each side of the board. He's got the c4 break, which will either force white to get to weaken their pawn structure like this, or if they play b takes c4, then he'll have c5, bishop d7, and he can target this isolated pawn on a4. So it's an interesting idea. Now they go back to shuffling for a little bit, and black plays g5. So that's his other pawn break. So he's really trying to play on both sides of the board. That being said, white is still very solid here. Puts his king on g3. The king on g3 is fairly well placed for now, because what it does is it prevents black from making progress unless they move their bishop. So now Ding Liren, so this was sort of an interesting decision here. He plays c5, c4, and we described the idea before. It's a little bit surprising to give a pawn like this. And the computer doesn't love it, but I actually do love it in the sense that I think it actually creates some imbalance in the position at the cost of a pawn. And that's what ultimately will put pressure on white to make a mistake. Because even though optically this position still seemed really good for black, there's not really too much of a plan. Like the main things that can happen here are just kind of shuffling. And I do believe that the trade of rooks would lead to a drawn endgame here, something like this. This is sort of the one that we have to evaluate if we're trying to make sure that this is a draw. But I do think that this position, bishop a5, if we get a position like this, that so many pawns come off, that white should be able to hold this without too many problems. But that does remain to be actually bishop a3 here is probably more precise. But that's that was the other option, was to go for this. Now we looked at the opposite colored bishop ending yesterday, and one of the key features that we've talked about is how with a pair of rooks, these opposite colored bishops actually tend to complicate the position and offer winning chances. And so normally the instinct of these super grandmasters will be to keep the rooks on the board for as long as possible when you're trying to win. So c4 and then c5. And so here you can imagine at least a position where the bishop gets to d7, takes the pawn on a4, and creates real chances. And that combined with maybe the possibility of creating a pass pawn on this side. So that's the dream. That being said, it's not so easy to achieve. So here he plays rook to c8. White had played rook d2 with the intention of trying to play d4 to either create a pass pawn or force a bunch of pawns off of the board. And this is where Hikaru played bishop a1, and that turns out to be the decisive mistake in the game. If he had played here rook f2, I think he would have had good chances to hold here. It's not obvious for black to come up with a plan. So what can we try here if we're black? One move I looked at was bishop d1, which might have been the move that Hikaru didn't like when moving the rook to f2. But here he could try to play just rook back to d2. And then if the bishop goes to g4, he's happy to repeat. And if h4, he can actually play king to h3 to prevent the bishop from coming here. So the bishop then has to go to h5. And it's not going to be so easy to get h4 in because our pawn will be hanging here. And I think after rook f2, white is pretty close to holding here because he wants to play rook f5. I think white is holding. So maybe bishop d1 is not the best try on rook f2, but what else can we do? It's not entirely obvious. We can make sort of, again, some waiting moves, rook d2, and then on rook f1. On rook f1, we can actually try. The other thing is that we can play for b3. And that was one of the ideas of this pawn sacrifice, is that we create this potential anyway to play something like this and rook to b8. Or actually, sorry, here we play rook takes d3. And we have some chances still to win a pawn. So that might be the other thing that Hikaru could have been a little bit concerned with, was the rook coming back to d8. And then if we play rook d2 to stop this idea, then we can again go rook f8. So it's still a somewhat difficult position to play. But white played bishop to a1. And this is our tactic of the day for today. I made a separate video with that. But here, black plays a very, very strong move, rook to f8. The rook is coming to f1. And from there, it will attack the bishop, which actually is almost out of squares. And the other idea is that after rook f1, black can also play bishop to d1 here. and then h4, and the king gets into a mating net. And there's really almost no defense here. One of the key things is that rook f2 doesn't work because of h4, picking up the rook here. King takes, rook f2. And another, yeah, so there's not really any move that prevents rook to f1. So white plays c3, trying to trade some pawns, and also the idea is that on rook f1, at least the bishop here is protected by the rook, so there's not a move like rook b1, which would force c3 and then b3, which could be awkward. However, here black simply continues with their plan, played bishop to d1, and it's amazing actually how this king just ends up in a mating net. There's not much that the white king can do. Hikaru played d4. There's not much that he can do here. If cb doesn't really help, we can actually just take it back. And king h2 would really lead to the same plan for black of playing h4 and then g4. And there's not a defense to this. And so, yeah, in the game he plays d4, and then look at how nicely it ends, h4. The king cannot come to h3 because of rook h1 checkmate. So the king goes to h2 and then g4. And now the threat is again g3 with rook h1 checkmate. And if white plays g3, then the cleanest is to just play h3 followed by bishop f3 and rook h1 mate, which is really nice. And there's no defense. Pretty amazing. Taking the bishop doesn't help because black is not only up in exchange, but he also has a very strong pass pawn on h3, a very strong pass pawn on b4. So obviously this is completely game over. So really nice game from Ding Liren, who managed to solve his opening problems thanks to some solid preparation, perhaps aided by Leela. And then he just managed to set enough problems for Hikaru to go wrong with the time winding down in the only decisive game of the day. So with that, Ding Liren wins this first mini match of the quarterfinals, and we will see if Hikaru can come back and equalize in just 2 days. So thank you for joining me for today's game of the day, and I will see you all tomorrow.